Alan Turing, a mathematical genius, successfully cracked the Nazi Enigma code, shortening World War II and creating the foundation of modern computing. However, his success sparked jealousy from industries and fear from the government over thinking machines. Amid betrayal, Turing was arrested for his sexual orientation, sentenced to hormone therapy that destroyed his body, and found dead mysteriously with a bitten apple beside him, a symbol that remains a mystery to this day. Years later, his name was recognized as the father of modern computing. The Turing machine became the basis of computers. The Turing test sparked the birth of AI, and his legacy was honored with the Turing Award. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted him a royal pardon, acknowledging the grave injustice that had been done. But did Turing really take his own life? Or was there a dark secret being hidden? And why did the bitten apple become such an everlasting symbol? Find out the truth in this story of mystery and tragedy. The autumn wind blew gently around the courtyard of Sherburne School, scattering brown leaves that spun slowly over the cobbled pathways. The school building stood grandly, towering with old stone walls covered in moss. In the distance, the cheerful sounds of children playing rugby filled the field. Their laughter and shouts echoed between the old buildings, bringing life to the cool, crisp air. However, in the quiet, dusty corner of the library, a 14-year-old boy had his head buried in a pile of books. His thin fingers traced line by line with extraordinary speed. His messy black hair fell over round glasses perched on his nose, reflecting the sunlight streaming in through the large window beside him. His name was Alan Turing. For him, the world outside the library window felt foreign and meaningless. The children who screamed and laughed on the field were nothing but blurry shadows to him, a crowd he never understood. For them, school days were filled with games, friendships, and little mischiefs that sparked joy. But for Alan, everything was different. His world consisted of codes and numbers, something that could be broken down and rearranged, just like a machine. Alan grew up in a family that was materially sufficient but emotionally cold. His father, Julius Turing, was a British government official who often worked in India. His absence from home made the figure of a father a distant entity for Alan. Even when he returned, Julius rarely spent time with his son. There was a moment when Alan was still a small boy. He came running with excitement, holding a small radio he had disassembled and rebuilt in his room. "Father, look, I managed to make it work again," he said proudly. Julius glanced up briefly from his newspaper, gave a short smile, and said, "That's good, Alan, but you should spend more time outside. Boys your age should be playing, not playing around with machines." Those words hit Alan like a hammer. He hugged his small radio tightly and walked back to his narrow room, where wires were scattered all over his study desk. For Alan, the crackling sound of electricity and the spinning of small gears felt far warmer than his father's cold and hollow smile. His mother, Ethel Sarah Turing, was a conservative woman who held firmly to the social values of her time. Ethel monitored every step Alan took with strict control, deciding how he dressed, how he spoke, even how he carried his books to school. In Ethel's eyes, Alan was an odd child. "Why don't you play outside with the other kids, Alan?" she asked one afternoon when she found Alan scribbling mathematical equations at the dining table. "I'm finishing this equation, Mom," Alan replied without lifting his gaze from the paper. "Playing outside is better. Normal boys don't spend their time in front of thick books like that," Ethel remarked with a slight hint of disapproval. Alan just nodded without saying much. He knew his mother would never understand that the numbers on the paper gave him warmth that he had never felt at home. At Sherburne School, Alan found his escape. While the other children played rugby on the field, he chose to sit quietly in the corner of the library, surrounded by thick books on Boolean logic and theory of relativity. To him, those numbers were like friends who never judged, never mocked, and always remained consistent. He would often stare out the library window, watching the children running, laughing, pushing each other, and shouting joyfully. Deep inside, Alan wondered, How can they be so happy? Why can they laugh without reason? That narrative always played in his mind every time he heard laughter from outside. On the other hand, he found solace in the silence of the library. There were no insults, no strange looks, only him and pure logic. Amidst his routine, Alan met a boy with golden blonde hair in the library. The boy wrote quickly in his notebook, with complex physics equations and formulas neatly drawn on its pages. "Do you understand all of that?" Alan asked softly, trying to break the silence. The boy looked up, smiled warmly. "Of course. Are you interested in physics too?" "Yes, very much," Alan replied briefly. "My name is Christopher Morcom. Alan Turing." From that day on, Alan's life changed. With Christopher, he discovered a new world he had never imagined before. A world where he could speak without fear of judgment, where his ideas were not considered strange. The two of them often spent time in the school laboratory, experimenting with magnets, wires, and small light bulbs. For Alan, Christopher was an escape from the coldness of his home and the loneliness that haunted him every night. One quiet afternoon, they lay on the grassy field, staring at the endless blue sky. Christopher gazed at the clouds drifting slowly above them and asked, "Do you think machines can think?" Alan paused for a moment, then replied, "If our brains are machines, why not? If we can understand how it works, we can replicate it." Christopher smiled widely. "One day, you'll create it, Alan. A machine that will never die. A machine that can think forever." That foreshadowing was deeply engraved in Alan's heart. That one day, he would create a machine that could think like a human. But that happiness did not last long. In 1930, Christopher fell ill with bovine tuberculosis. Alan visited him every day in the hospital, bringing books and their experimental notes. "You'll get better," Alan said. Christopher only smiled weakly. "That machine, you have to create it, Alan," he said before finally breathing his last. The loss hit Alan hard. At the funeral, he stood far from the crowd, clutching Christopher's notebook tightly, promising to himself that he would create something that would never die. From that day forward, Alan locked himself in his room, surrounded by piles of books and scattered wires. He sketched diagrams, wrote equations, and scribbled notes. In his mind, he imagined a machine that could think. "If humans can die, then I will create something that cannot. Something that can think." Like Christopher, Alan called it the eternal machine, a concept that would later be known as the Turing machine. In his mind, he believed that if the machine could be created, Christopher's memory would never truly die. The cold wind swept through the countryside of Buckinghamshire, carrying the scent of wet leaves scattered across the muddy ground. Amidst the thick fog stood a grand Victorian-style building, surrounded by tall, iron fences. To the untrained eye, it appeared to be just another old estate, but within its walls lay one of England's greatest secrets, Bletchley Park. Alan Turing stepped out of the black car that had brought him there. His breath was visible in the chilly air, and his eyes focused on the large, oak-colored door. Two guards in military uniforms stood stiffly on either side of the door, rifles slung over their shoulders, their sharp eyes observing every step. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a long corridor filled with the sounds of typewriters clacking, the hum of mechanical calculators, and hurried footsteps. Papers were stacked on every desk, chalkboards filled with complex codes, and faces, tired yet determined, focused intently on their work. A tall man with silver hair approached. His face was stern, his gaze sharp. "You must be Turing." His voice was deep and measured. "Yes, sir," Alan replied, extending his hand. The man did not shake it. "I'm Commander Alastair Denniston." He introduced himself curtly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Follow me." Denniston led Alan into a small room with a large chalkboard filled with scribbled codes. Numbers were lined up neatly. Foreign symbols filled the corners of the board, and arrows pointed to various points that looked impossibly complex. "I assume you know what this is," Denniston said, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Alan stepped forward, his eyes scanning the codes swiftly. His hand reached out, picking up a piece of chalk lying on the table, and without saying a word, he began to scribble on the board. Mathematical formulas flowed from his fingertips, line after line, until finally he stopped. Deniston watched with raised eyebrows. "That is correct," he murmured, half in disbelief. Alan turned, a faint smile appearing on his face. "It's just logic, sir." Deniston leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms over his chest. "So you think you can break Enigma?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Alan nodded confidently. "It's not about thinking. It's about logic. Enigma is just another machine, and machines are predictable." Deniston smirked, skepticism evident in his eyes. "Then I hope your logic is stronger than German iron," he said before leaving the room. Alan stared back at the chalkboard, as if the codes were dancing before him, taunting him to break them. For him, they were not just numbers and symbols, they were puzzles waiting to be unraveled. Alan followed Deniston's quick steps through the narrow hallway until they reached a room marked with a plaque that read Hut 8. Inside, the clacking of typewriters filled the air, and people worked tirelessly, recording secret codes from intercepted German radio signals. "Welcome to Hut 8, Deniston said in his heavy voice. "Your job is simple. Break Enigma." Alan raised his eyebrows. "Just that easy?" "The easiest job in the world," Deniston replied sarcastically. "For the last 5 years, nobody has done it." In the corner of the room, a young woman with long brown hair and thin-rimmed glasses was staring intently at rows of numbers. Occasionally, her hand moved swiftly, jotting notes in a thick notebook. "That's Joan Clark," Deniston pointed. "She's one of her best. You'll work with her." Alan nodded, approaching Joan's desk. "Alan Turing," he greeted her. Joan looked up, offering a warm smile. "Joan Clark. Heard a lot about you." "All good, I hope," Alan replied with a small grin. In the center of the room stood a large, gleaming black device with rows of buttons and spinning rotors. It looked intricate, as if it concealed thousands of secrets within its mechanical movements. "This is Enigma," Joan explained. "Every day, the Germans change the code. That's 150 trillion possible combinations." Alan gazed at the machine, his eyes shining with curiosity. His hands touched the cold metal surface, feeling the mechanical pulse from within. 150 trillion. "That's impossible to do manually," he murmured. Joan nodded. "That's why we're here, to make the impossible possible." When Alan proposed building an electromechanical machine capable of processing Enigma's codes automatically, the atmosphere in Hut 8 turned tense. Some of the senior cryptographers glared at him with skeptical eyes. "You want to build a machine to fight another machine?" asked an older man with thin hair and round glasses, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Precisely," Alan replied without hesitation. A soft chuckle erupted from the corner of the room. "That's impossible," said another. "We've been doing this for years with pen and paper. A machine won't change that." Alan remained calm. "That's why it's failed. Because humans are slow and machines are fast. We need to match their speed." Joan stood by Alan's side, her gaze sharp as she looked at the cryptographers. "We have nothing to lose by trying," she said firmly, breaking the silence. Amidst the skepticism, Alan and Joan began their work. They drew blueprints on large boards, designed electromagnetic circuits, and jotted down complex logic formulas. Every night, they worked late, accompanied only by the clatter of typewriters and the weary sighs of exhaustion. The machine was named Bomb, an electromechanical device capable of testing thousands of code combinations in mere minutes. "If it works," Jones said, looking at the half-assembled machine. "Not if. When?" Alan replied firmly. Months passed with no results. The bomb was still under construction, and the British government was growing impatient. One cold morning, Alan received a summons to meet with Commander Deniston in his office. The door creaked open, and Deniston sat behind a large wooden desk, stacks of reports laid out before him. "Turing, sit down," he ordered curtly. Alan sat without a word. "It's been months," Deniston's voice was firm and straightforward. Where are the results? Alan placed his hands on the desk, meeting Deniston's eyes calmly. Machines take time. We're building something that has never existed before, he replied confidently. Deniston leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp. People are dying, Turing. U-boats are sinking our ships. We need results, not promises. Alan paused, taking a deep breath. Give me one more month, he said. Deniston stared at him for a long moment before finally nodding. You have 4 weeks. If I don't see results, you're out. The room in Hut 8, usually quiet, was now filled with hurried footsteps, the clanging of metal, and the crackling of welding sparks. Old rusty machines were pushed aside, making room for the series of electromechanical devices that began to take shape on the cold concrete floor. In the center of the room, Alan stood with oil-stained hands, holding a large blueprint filled with mechanical sketches. Beside him, Joan Clark held a thick notebook, jotting down every formula Alan wrote on the large chalkboard. We need at least 20 rotating drums, Alan said, pointing at the diagram in front of him. Each drum will represent one of Enigma's rotors. The machine has to cycle through every possible combination. Fast, Joan nodded. And the wiring? How do we synchronize it? We use the same logic as Enigma, but in reverse. Instead of encrypting, we decrypt, Alan replied confidently. Deniston's words echoed in Alan's mind. In Hut 8, he and Joan worked tirelessly, without regard for the time of day. The electromechanical machines began to take form, with rotating drums, wiring connections, and relays clicking in rhythm. We need to make it faster, Joan said one evening. Her eyes were red from sleepless nights, but her spirit remained unbroken. It will be, Alan replied confidently, connecting the last wire to the control panel. In the midst of all the busyness, the senior cryptographers still looked at them with doubt. Alan didn't care. For him, logic would always triumph over disbelief. Deniston's words echoed in Alan's mind. In Hut 8, he and Joan worked tirelessly, without regard for the time of day. The electromechanical machines began to take form, with rotating drums, wiring connections, and relays clicking in rhythm. We need to make it faster, Joan said one evening. Her eyes were red from sleepless nights, but her spirit remained unbroken. It will be, Alan replied confidently, connecting the last wire to the control panel. In the midst of all the busyness, the senior cryptographers still looked at them with doubt. Alan didn't care. For him, logic would always triumph over disbelief. On a cold and silent night, the whirring of bomb filled the room. The large drums spun rapidly, producing a steady mechanical rhythm. Indicator lights flickered, as if the machine itself was thinking. Joan stood beside Alan, her eyes focused on the rows of numbers appearing on the screen. Come on, she whispered softly. Suddenly, a green light on the side of the machine blinked. Joan covered her mouth, her eyes widened. Alan, it worked, her voice trembled. Alan nodded, a small smile creeping onto his lips. Of course it did, he whispered. It's just logic. The room erupted into cheers. People hugged, clapped, some even cried with relief. But Alan remained still, watching the machine spin as if it were speaking to him. But that victory came with a price. A few days after bomb's success, they decrypted a code revealing an imminent U-boat attack on a convoy of Allied ships. Joan approached, handing the report to Alan. We have to warn them, she said seriously. Alan read the document with a blank expression. If we warn them, the Germans will know. They'll change their codes. All of this, all of it, will be worthless, he replied calmly. We can save them, Alan. Joan looked at him, her eyes welling up with tears. And lose the war, Alan answered without hesitation. Sometimes logic is cruel. Joan fell silent. In her eyes, she no longer saw Alan as just a brilliant mathematician. She saw someone who had begun to replace humanity with absolute logic. On a quiet night, Alan sat alone in front of bomb, still spinning. His hand touched the machine's buttons, feeling the electromagnetic pulse moving endlessly. If this machine can break Enigma, What else can it do? He whispered softly. Can it think? The sky over Manchester was gray as Alan Turing stepped out of the train station. The autumn wind tugged at his long coat, and the cold air seeped into his bones. In his hand, he held an old suitcase filled with notes, machine diagrams, and mathematical formulas. There was no grand welcome, no ceremony of recognition. His victory at Bletchley Park was buried under layers of government secrecy. Alan returned to the University of Manchester as a mathematics professor. But within the campus walls, he was just another academic. No one knew that behind his quiet demeanor lay the man who broke the Enigma code and shortened the war by years. Every time there was a discussion about post-war technology, Alan would simply smile, holding back the information boiling inside his head. The secrets of Bletchley Park kept him from sharing the immense knowledge he possessed. But that did not stop him from pushing forward. In his small, dusty office, Turing began drawing up a grand concept, the universal Turing machine. On a large chalkboard, he sketched process diagrams, mechanical machines capable of storing instructions, calculating, and processing data automatically. If a machine can read instructions, then it can think, he murmured, writing symbol after symbol with white chalk. In 1945, Turing published a paper titled Computing Machinery and Intelligence, introducing the concept of the universal Turing machine, a theoretical device capable of simulating any algorithmic process. In the middle of a discussion room on campus, academics gathered. Some read the paper with furrowed brows, others simply watched with skepticism. So, you're saying that a machine can solve complex logical problems without human intervention? Asked an older professor with a mocking tone. Not just solve, Turing replied confidently. The machine can store instructions, process data, and make decisions based on logic. Not just calculate, but think. Laughter erupted from the corner of the room. A thinking machine? Sounds more like a science fiction novel than mathematics, sneered another lecturer. Turing looked at them, unfazed. In his mind, he knew this concept would change the world. In 1946, Turing was appointed as the head of research at the National Physical Laboratory in London. There, he began designing the automatic computing engine, the world's first computer to use the concept of a stored program. Turing stood in the middle of a large room filled with typewriters, piles of paper, and scattered diagrams on the tables. Around him, technicians watched in confusion as he explained his designs. ACE will not just calculate numbers, he said, pointing to a large diagram on the chalkboard. This machine will store instructions in its memory. Imagine a machine that can remember what it needs to do. We won't have to rewrite commands every time we want it to work. One of the technicians raised his hand. But how can a machine store instructions? That surpasses any technology we have. Turing gave a small smile. That's what we're going to build. Turing's grand vision was not welcomed by everyone. Some senior technicians at NPL saw his idea as pure fantasy. Dr. Edward Milton, the head technician with over 20 years of experience, became his most vocal critic. Machines don't think, Turing, he scoffed during one of the NPL meetings. You're dreaming too high. Even the best machines in the world can't store memory. Not memory, Milton. Instructions, Turing responded, staring directly into his eyes. And those instructions will be stored in memory. The machine won't need to be told what to do repeatedly. That's what will make it think logically. Milton chuckled dismissively. You're wasting our time, our money, and our resources, all for something that hasn't even been proven to work. Not proven yet, Turing replied calmly. But it will be. Amidst all the pressure, Joan Clark reappeared in his life. One cloudy spring afternoon, Joan knocked on Alan's laboratory door at NPL. Joan, Alan looked surprised. I heard you could use some moral support, Joan replied with a smile. Joan brought along books on mathematics and logic theory. They often worked together late into the night, discussing how machines could store and execute commands independently. If this machine works, Joan said, staring at the diagrams on the chalkboard, you won't just change how we calculate. You'll change how we think. That's the plan. Turing replied with a faint smile. In 1950, Turing released a paper titled Computing Machinery and Intelligence. In it, he posed the grand question, can machines think? To answer this, he introduced the concept of the Turing test, an experiment to measure a machine's ability to exhibit intelligent behavior indistinguishable from that of a human. The academic world was divided. Some called the idea revolutionary, while others mocked it. To Turing, it wasn't just a concept, it was the future. However, Turing's progress was not warmly welcomed by the government. British intelligence began to monitor his work at NPL, suspecting that the concept of a thinking machine could threaten national security. One day, Turing was summoned by a secret agent. The room was dark, illuminated only by a desk lamp. "We hear that the machine you're building can think," the agent said coldly. "It can process logic," Turing responded without hesitation. "And who ensures that logic doesn't turn against us?" Turing remained silent. In his heart, he knew that artificial intelligence was not a threat. It was an opportunity. In his quiet office, Turing gazed at the ACE machine, spinning slowly. His hand touched the cold metal panel, feeling the mechanical pulse working tirelessly. If machines can learn, maybe one day they can dream, he whispered softly. The skies over London were gray as Alan Turing stepped up to the small podium in front of a crowded conference hall. Behind him, a large screen displayed the diagram of the automatic computing engine, the world's first stored program machine, where instructions and data were stored simultaneously within the machine's memory. Scientists, engineers, and journalists from various countries gathered to witness the presentation of the father of modern computing. Turing spoke calmly, explaining how ACE could solve complex calculations in mere seconds. This machine is not just a calculator. It can think, execute instructions, and transform data into information automatically, he stated with confidence. The room erupted in applause, but in the dark corners, a few men in expensive suits whispered among themselves. CEOs from major companies like Ferrari, IBM, and General Electric viewed Turing's concept as a direct threat to their dominance in the technology industry. "If this thing works," whispered one of the executives, "we're out of business." Not long after Turing's presentation, political pressure began to mount. Major corporations started lobbying the British government to tighten regulations on logic-based technologies. They labeled it as a potential threat to economic stability and industry control. One foggy morning, Turing received an urgent call to attend a closed-door meeting at Parliament. The room was dark, illuminated only by a single desk lamp in the center. Several politicians and government officials sat in a circle, their faces stern and unyielding. "Mr. Turing, you've built a machine that can think," said one of the officials with a firm tone. "It processes logic," Turing replied without hesitation. "And what happens when logic no longer serves its creator?" asked another official, his voice low and whispery. Turing stared straight at them. "Machines follow commands. They don't act on their own. They simply execute logic." A tall man leaned back in his chair, locking eyes with Turing. "Logic can turn dangerous if left unchecked. How do we control it?" Turing paused for a moment. "You don't control logic. You guide it." There was a brief silence before one of the politicians placed a document in front of Turing. "Effective immediately, your access to military research is revoked. Your machine will be under government supervision." The news of the restrictions spread quickly across National Physical Laboratory. Technicians began to distance themselves, and the one solid team that worked alongside Turing gradually dissolved. Amidst the uncertainty, Dr. Edward Milton, the head technician who had opposed Turing's ideas from the start, seized the opportunity. He began lobbying the government to permanently shut down the ACE project. "Turing's machine is a fantasy, a drain on our resources," he declared during a meeting with NPL executives. "You want us to abandon it?" asked a board member, his voice tinged with doubt. "I want us to be realistic," Milton replied coldly. "We don't need a machine that thinks. We need machines that work. Day by day, Turing arrived at the laboratory to find fewer and fewer people willing to work with him. The machines that once whirred and spun with life now stood still, covered in dust, abandoned by the very people who once believed in them. One cold winter night in 1952, a loud knock echoed through Turing's home. Two police officers stood at the door, their faces stern and unyielding. "Alan Matheson, Turing?" "Yes. You are under arrest for gross indecency." Turing stood silently. Through the window, neighbors peeked out, whispering behind half-drawn curtains. In the cold interrogation room, Turing sat alone, his hands shackled to a metal table. An inspector tossed a case file onto the table before him. "We know about Arnold Murray," the inspector said flatly. "And," Turing replied calmly, "it's a crime, Mr. Turing. Homosexuality is against the law." Turing stared straight ahead. "I've broken codes that saved millions of lives. And this is how I'm repaid." The inspector said nothing. He simply placed a paper in front of Turing. "Sign the confession, and we'll make it easy. You have two choices: imprisonment or chemical castration." Turing stared at the document for a long time. His hands, which once danced over typewriters and machines, now trembled. Finally, he took the pen and signed. "Good choice," the inspector said, a cold smile spreading across his face. Weeks after the trial, Turing began hormone therapy. His body grew weaker, his muscles deteriorated, and his mind began to fog. In the small laboratory inside his home, he sat before the machines he had built, struggling to write equations that once came so easily to him. "I've built you, and now I'm the one who's breaking," he whispered softly to the ACE machine that stood silent in the corner. The British government banned Turing from working on secret projects. His research was halted, and his access to military labs was permanently revoked. Dr. Edward Milton took over the ACE project and publicly announced its termination at an NPL board meeting. In the midst of his downfall, only one person continued to write him letters: Joan Clark. "You're still the greatest mind I've ever known," Joan wrote in one of her letters. But Turing never replied. In his final days, Turing wrote a letter that he never sent. The mind of a machine is only limited by the mind of its creator. If we dare to dream, it will dare to live. He folded the letter carefully, placed it inside an envelope, and tucked it away in his notebook, filled with formulas and machine sketches. The skies over Wilmslow were grim as the winter wind blew harshly, shaking the branches of the bare trees in front of the small Victorian house. Inside, Alan Turing sat in his cramped workspace, surrounded by machines that had once been his greatest achievements. On the corner of his desk, stacks of notes filled with logic equations and machine diagrams piled up, some yellowing with age. Turing stared at his trembling hands as he tried to write equations on paper. The hands that were once steady and nimble now shook, the effect of the hormone therapy he had undergone in place of imprisonment. The hormones weakened his muscles, slowed his mind, and left him with constant pain in his joints. He took a long breath, gazing at the machines that stood around the room. AC, which once spun with spirit and life, now lay covered in dust, like artifact from a forgotten past. Yet in Turing's eyes, those machines were alive. They never judged, never abandoned him, and never questioned who he was. "If only you could speak," he whispered softly, running his hand over the cold metal panel. "Perhaps you would understand." On June 7th, 1954, the skies over Wilmslow were once again gray. Light rain drizzled over rooftops as a gardener who usually tended Turing's yard knocked on the front door. There was no answer. After several attempts, the gardener called the police. The door was forced open, and they found Alan Turing lying still on his bed. On the bedside table, there was an apple, bitten, still fresh, yet untouched further. Around the room, the machines he had built stood silent but steady, as if waiting for their master to wake them once again. Forensic examinations concluded that the apple had been laced with cyanide. The investigation ruled it a suicide, but many speculated otherwise. Some believed it was a hidden message, an homage to the Snow-White fairy tale that Turing adored, where the princess falls into eternal sleep from a poisoned apple. But others argued that his death was too neat, too well-timed. Speculations arose that the British government, seeing him as a threat, had secured Turing quietly. On the day of his funeral, only a few attended. Joan Clark stood at the front, staring at the wooden coffin as it was lowered into the ground. In her hand, she held tightly to the last letter Turing had sent her. The mind of a machine is only limited by the mind of its creator. If we dare to dream, it will dare to live. Time passed, but Alan Turing's legacy never truly faded. In the 1970s and 1980s, the concept of the Turing machine began to be taught in major universities as the foundation of modern computer science. Technology researchers began to realize that the design of the automatic computing engine Turing created was the precursor to the modern computers we use today. The development of artificial intelligence also found its roots in the Turing test, an experiment he created to measure a machine's ability to exhibit intelligent behavior. Modern machines that can talk, understand instructions, and learn from experience reflect the grand dream that Turing once sketched out on paper years before. Can machines think? The question that was once mocked now became the foundation for technological advancements across the world. In 2013, nearly 60 years after his death, Alan Turing's name echoed once more across the globe. Pressure from scientific communities, human rights activists, and academics forced the British government to revisit his case. Queen Elizabeth II officially granted a royal pardon to Alan Turing, acknowledging that his prosecution was a grave injustice and should never have happened. In a ceremony held at Westminster Hall, scientists, government officials, and Turing's family gathered solemnly. On a large screen, a photograph of the young Turing was displayed, his smile faint, his eyes full of ambition. Today, we recognize the legacy of a man who changed the world, a man who saved millions of lives, yet was condemned for who he was. A high-ranking official spoke with a heavy voice. Applause filled the room, while outside, thousands gathered, holding signs that read, "Thank you, Alan Turing. You gave us the future." As a form of respect, the scientific community established the Turing Award in 1966, regarded as the Nobel Prize of Computer Science. Every year, the best researchers in technology receive the award, and on the podium, Turing's name was always mentioned as the pioneer who paved the way for everything that existed today. Without Turing, one award recipient said, there would be no digital age. Today, Alan Turing's name is immortalized in universities, laboratories, and research centers across the globe. Young generations study the concept of the Turing machine as the foundation of computer science, while AI researchers continue to develop intelligent machines based on his vision. A plaque in front of the University of Manchester reads, "Machines can think because he dared to dream." In a modern laboratory, engineers were assembling a quantum computer. On the back wall, a large photograph of Alan Turing was displayed, gazing down with a faint smile. A young researcher approached and whispered softly, "Thank you, Mr. Turing. We're just getting started."